In the next few videos, let us study the various aspects of medulla oblongata. Medulla oblongata is actually the lowest part of the brainstem. So as we ascend upwards from the spinal cord, this forms the first higher center. It's pyriform shaped, alternatively named as bulb, resulting in certain terminologies like bulbar or pseudobulbar palsy or even corticobulbar fibers, etc. Medulla oblongata develops from myelencephalon part of the hindbrain vesicle. This being the first video, let us begin by studying its external features. Being the caudalmost part of the brainstem, it is located in the lower part of the posterior cranial fossa. It is immediately behind the clivus, separated just by the layers of meninges, and posteriorly it is related to cerebellum as well as cisterna magna. Medulla contains nuclei of lower cranial nerves, certain precerebellar nuclei, dorsal column pathway nuclei. It also contains reticular formation, which includes certain vital centers like cardiac and respiratory centers. It not only forms the thoroughway for ascending and descending tracts of spinal cord, but also forms the point of origin or termination for the tracts of medulla itself. It extends from the lower pontine margin, otherwise known as pontomedullary junction. Medulla is the only part of the brain that exits out of the skull by passing through the foramen magnum, and it ends at a plane that passes just above the exit of first pair of cervical spinal nerves. Now this plane corresponds to the level of upper border of arch of atlas posteriorly and center of the dens anteriorly. It's about 3 centimeters long, and at its widest it has a diameter of about 2 centimeters. Compared to the external features of the spinal cord, this small part has various interesting features on its surface. So let us begin by studying the ventral surface. So firstly, along the midline there is ventral median fissure, which is a continuation of the same named fissure in the spinal cord. However, this fissure is interrupted below by the pyramidal decussation, and it ends at the pontomedullary junction in a blind ending foramen cecum. On either side of this ventral median fissure, we have two elongated swellings called as pyramids, which contain the corticospinal tract fibers. So, in fact, the presence of the corticospinal tract fibers in these pyramids is what gives them the name as pyramidal tract. Lateral to the pyramids, there is another oval swelling on either side called as olive, which overlies the inferior olivary nuclear complex. Between the pyramids and olive, we have ventrolateral sulcus, and lateral to olive, we have dorsolateral sulcus. Both of these are again continuous with the same named sulci on the surface of spinal cord. Again, similar to the sulci on the surface of spinal cord, both these sulci will also mark the point of entry or exit for the cranial nerves. Now, in relation to medulla, the 6th, 7th and 8th cranial nerves exit from the pontomedullary junction. 9th, 10th, 11th and 12th cranial nerves exit from the surface of the medulla itself. Abducens nerve exits above the pyramid at the pontomedullary junction. Facial nerve with its nervus intermedius component and the vestibulocochlear nerve will exit above the olive and dorsolateral tract, again along the pontomedullary junction. The glossopharyngeal, vagus and cranial accessory nerve, they exit along the dorsolateral sulcus from above downwards in multiple rootlets. In fact, the uppermost rootlets belong to 9th cranial nerve, and the lower ones are the 10th and 11th subsequently. The rootlets of hypoglossal nerve exit along the ventrolateral sulcus. Now this is to be expected because ventrolateral sulcus will form the exit point for the ventral roots, which are motor nerves. So also the hypoglossal nerve, which is the motor nerve, will be exiting through the ventrolateral sulcus. Whereas the 9th, 10th, 11th nerves are the mixed nerves. They exit along the dorsolateral sulcus. Now coming to the lateral aspect of the medulla oblongata, its lower half is known as tuberculum cinereum, which overlies the spinal tract and nucleus of trigeminal nerve. Now this is an important landmark to perform tractotomy in case of trigeminal neuralgia. Upper half of the lateral aspect is occupied by a large bundle of fibers known as inferior cerebellar peduncle, which connect various tracts from the medulla to the cerebellum. Now coming to the ventricular system within the medulla, it is represented by both central canal as well as part of the fourth ventricle. Central canal from the spinal cord continues into the lower half of the medulla. As it ascends, it shifts dorsally and opens into the cavity of fourth ventricle in the upper medulla. So this lower part of the medulla containing central canal is known as closed part, and upper part of the medulla related to the fourth ventricle is known as open part. Now this information is important when we are studying the dorsal surface of the medulla oblongata. So dorsal aspect will be studied as two separate parts. One, we study the dorsal aspect of the lower closed part of the medulla, which is continuous with the dorsal surface of spinal cord. And the second one, we study the dorsal aspect of the upper open medulla, where we are actually seeing the posterior aspect of the cavity of ventricle. As we are seeing it in the ice cream cone here, the lower closed part and the upper open part are in two separate planes. Now, one is the inside of a cavity, that is upper part, open part is the inside of the ventricular cavity, whereas lower closed part is the dorsum of the neural tube itself. So let us first consider the dorsal part of the lower closed portion. We find the dorsal median sulcus along the midline, which is continuous with the same name sulcus on the spinal cord. On either side of this dorsal median sulcus, we see two elongated elevations, which are called as gracile tubercles or clava. They overlie the nucleus gracilis, into which the fibers of the fasciculus gracilis terminate. Lateral to these gracile tubercles, we find a pair of cuneate tubercles, which again overlie the nucleus cuneatus, within which the fibers of the fasciculus cuneatus will terminate. The gracile and the cuneate tubercles on either side are separated from each other by posterior intermediate sulcus. Again, this sulcus continues with the same name sulcus in the spinal cord. Now coming to the open medulla, this forms the lower half of the floor of the fourth ventricle, and hence it is, as we have shown through the ice cream cone, it's in a different plane than the dorsal surface in case of closed part. So above this part is roughly demarcated by the transversely running fibers of this stria medullaris, which separate the pons above from the medulla below. Now dorsal upper surface is again divided by a median sulcus into right and left halves. But mind you, this sulcus is not to be confused with the dorsal median sulcus in the closed part. On either side of this median sulcus, there is a faint sulcus limitans, which divides each half into medial eminence medially and a vestibular area laterally. Sulcus limitans ends inferiorly in a shallow triangular depression known as inferior fovea. So the area of medial eminence in the medulla is represented by hypoglossal trigone overlying the hypoglossal nucleus. Vestibular area overlies the vestibular nuclei, especially the inferior and medial nuclei. Inferior fovea represents the vagal trigone overlying the dorsal nucleus of the vagus. And this triangle is again crossed by a translucent ridge known as funiculus separatus, which separates the rest of the inferior fovea from the area postrema. Both this funiculus separatus and the area postrema, they have modified blood-brain barrier, and this area postrema contains certain chemosensitive cells, and therefore it can act as a vomiting center. So this lower half of floor of the fourth ventricle, which is triangular in shape, in fact has been described to be resembling a nib of a fountain pen. So an artistic name of Calamus scriptorius has also been given to it. Either way, its lateral margins are bounded by the inferior cerebellar peduncles. So we have now seen the ventral, lateral and dorsal aspects of the medulla externally. So we can hereafter proceed to study the internal features of the medulla by studying it at various levels by taking sections. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed this video. Visit this site for other neuroanatomy videos. Thank you.